This is Dominissimo Voxlore, broadcasting from the throne world Shadow, where history bleeds into eternity. In this transmission we recount the saga of the Horus Heresy, of triumph and treachery, of brother turned against brother, and of the Emperor's final terrible sacrifice. From Ullanor's triumph to the burning of Prospero, from the massacres of Isstvan to the Siege of Terra itself. This is the tale of mankind's darkest hour, and the dawn of the Imperium we know today. Strike the seal of subscription, or be lost to the shadows of history. Steel your faith, ready your heart, and bear witness to this chronicle. This is the voice of Dominissimo, and this is the lore of the Horus Heresy. They say the old knight swallowed mankind without mercy, 10,000 fragmented kingdoms clutching like candles in a storm. But on Terra, the storm broke. The Emperor won the unification wars in ash and thunder, cast down the techno-barbarian tyrants, and raised a single banner over the cradle of our species. From that hard-won silence, he spoke a simple charge that would reshape the stars. Unite, illuminate, end the long night. The first step was Sol itself. Luna, once a fortress of gene guilds and rogue forges, fell into compliance beneath disciplined orbital fire and the cold perfection of gene-bred infantry. Saturnine shipyards were pacified. Mercury's furnace hives bent the knee. With the Sol system secured, the Emperor turned to the red wills whose engine had never truly stilled. Mars. Upon the dust of Olympus Mons, oaths were traded, knowledge for protection, industry for purpose. The Mechanicum pledged its forges to the dream of a greater Imperium, and in return the Emperor promised the right to build, to seek, to remember. It was an alliance of necessity and vision, and it armed the future. Yet armies alone cannot reclaim a galaxy, they must be led. The Emperor's answer to that riddle was written in flesh and myth. 20 primarchs, conceived as living generals and symbols, each a different blade in the same hand. The warp scattered those infants to distant worlds, an act of malice, or fate, or both. But the Emperor did not pause. From the Primarch's genetic templates he wrought the Legion Astartes, post-human warriors, faster than thought, tireless as engine pistons, sworn to a common destiny. On Terra, the first legions drilled beneath a sky still stained by the unification fires. They learned a new lexicon of war, reconnaissance in force, void supremacy actions, compliance by phases, annihilation when required. Remembrancers did not yet sketch their images. Iterators did not yet gild their words. It was pure, austere soldiering, guided by imperial truth. No gods, no kings but reason, and a future in which mankind could master both the map and the myth of the cosmos. Then the fleets were lit. Expeditionary armadas pushed from Sol like spear points, escorted by newly sworn Titan legions and flotillas crewed by void-born clans who had called starships home since before the old night. At each new system the same ritual unfolded. Vox helmets carried terms of compliance. Shed tyranny, banish superstition, render tithe and knowledge. Join the Imperium's project for humanity united. Many welcomed it with exhausted relief. Some hesitated. Some bared their teeth. When words failed, the Astartes spoke in iron. Across the early decades, the legions learned the grammar of reconquest. Urban worlds demanded precise decapitation strikes. Strike the command spine, leave the body standing. Feudal worlds required careful amputations of aristocratic rot, followed by sutures of infrastructure and law. Rogue human empires, drunk on their own survival myths, had to be humbled without breaking their capacity to contribute. And beyond them, the Xenos. Some could be bargained with to secure passage or time, most could not. There were orcoid war hosts whose laughter filled the void with crude, brutal radio noise, crystalline insects that spoke in light and treachery, and things that wore the geometry of life incorrectly, as if time itself had grown a tumour. It was not a single war, it was a million small wars braided into a single road. In those years the legions began to find what they had lost. On a blasted world of hive shafts and knife cultures, a primarch was recognised and reclaimed. Elsewhere, a warrior king wearing the dust of his adopted son yielded to the father he never met. Another ruled an empire of parchment and policy, and stepped smiling into truer duty. Each reunion altered a legion as surely as reforging a blade. Battle doctrines shifted, colours changed, oaths were rewritten. The legion became extensions of will, not just war, but their father's philosophy soaked into their steel. The Emperor did not merely conquer, he standardised. Compliance edicts prescribed secular governance, calendrical reform, and the indexing of knowledge. Iterator cores travelled behind the spear tips, explaining in clear, relentless language why the old myths must be set aside. Administratum cadres catalogued tithe rates and industrial yields. Cartographers laid down new star lines on a living map that spread, month by month, like fire through dry scrub. Some conquests were tragedies measured in fleet manifests. The Rangdan Xenocides scolded entire expeditionary groups out of their ledger. In their wake, New patterns of caution and massed force replaced early war exuberance. Elsewhere, triumph. The pacification of the ghoul stars choked off horrors that fed on the edges of human night. Compliance on far-flung agri-wars stabilised supply chains that stretched from the Halo Star's frost to the heart of Sol. Forged treaties with Mars' daughter worlds embedded engines and ordnance along the Crusade's length, turning victories into infrastructure rather than monuments. And everywhere, efficiency sharpened cruelty. Cities that embraced the Imperial truth rose into the light of a common purpose. Cities that refused learned the Imperium had no patience for kings who dressed superstition in gold. Orbital batteries spoke, drop assaults in the pre-dawn, 2 hours of screaming, then silence, and the long work of rebuilding, water, power, law, schools, tithes. The legions were not executioners by preference, but they were unflinching when preference was irrelevant. Within the machine of reconquest, culture became a weapon. The Imperial truth was more than a slogan, it was an operating system. Schools replaced shrines, the Canada reset the year to the Emperor's Rising. Vox networks stitched worlds into a shared conversation that left less room for local gods to breathe. The intention was not to empty life of meaning, but to stack meaning where it served survival. In human hands, human minds, human futures. As victories piled upward, the Crusade learned humility. Worlds that looked simple from orbit knotted into insoluble problems on the ground. Prairie planets hid insurgencies with patience enough to bleed a garrison a man at a time for a decade. Ship graveyard systems concealed predators that struck once in a century and made that once count. The answer, always, was adaptation. Astartes modified assault patterns, iterators rewrote their scripts, logisticians bent supply lines around worlds instead of snapping them over the break. Through it all, the Emperor moved at the centre like a calm eye in a moving storm. He walked where the fighting was ugliest when his presence mattered, then vanished into corridors of strategy and statecraft when it mattered more. His generals learned to read the why behind the what. A forced march because a harvest 2 sectors away would fail without a railway seized today. A sudden parley because a surrender on this moon would open up 10 more doors without firing a shot. By the middle span of the Great Crusade, the map of man no longer looked like a broken mirror. It looked like a constellation being redrawn. Lines connected, fleets travelled safely through corridors of beacon light. A grandmother on a mining world could send a letter to a grandson born aboard a void ship and expect, with reasonable faith, that it would arrive before both were dust. That had not been true for 2 millennia. And the cost? The ledger is honest. The Astartes paid in gene seed and names etched into armour plates recovered from cooling mud. Human regiments paid in sons and daughters and in the quieting of songs that no longer fit the new calendar. Xenos civilizations, some vile, some merely incompatible, paid in extinction. The Crusade was a forge. Everything that entered it changed, or cracked. But consider the alternative. Consider the nights that stretch forever because no one lights a fire. Consider the averted extinctions, the slavers whose black lattice was cut to pieces, the plague that died in quarantine because an orbiting surveyor noticed, the tyrant who did not become a god because his people learned to ask why and kept asking until the throne rotted under him. On some distant day, a triumph would be held that drew every eye and every camera, and the galaxy would chant a single name. That is another chapter. Here, at the start, the work is less gilded and no less holy. Fleet mustering notices, engines start counters, oaths sworn beneath bare bulbs, the first footfall through a breach in a wall that had been a border for 1,000 years. This is the Great Crusade as it truly was. Grinding, righteous, imperfect and inevitable. A bridge from what we endured to what we dared to become. The triumph of Ullanor was crafted to be remembered, but its purpose was simpler, to place a single name upon a million banners. Processional avenues ran like rivers of colour through a plain where orc citadels had once stabbed the sky. Titan legions stood sentinel, their shadowed carapaces reflecting a sea of mortal faces. The legions marched in measured thunder, each a different cadence of glory. On a dais of void black stone, the Emperor waited, his presence stilling even the engines. Horus mounted the steps with easy strength of a god-given human shape. Lunar wolf white armour burnished to a sunlit sheen, laurels bound around a brow that had known 1,000 command decisions. He looked neither left nor right as the roar thickened. He did not need to. He could feel it in the air, in the pulse under his skin, the Imperium's breath drawing in. The Emperor spoke. Words measured like weights on a balance, sentences forged to carry across centuries. He praised the legions, named worlds freed, evoked the long pain of old night and the promise of its ending. Then his voice narrowed to a point. Horus Lupercal, he said, my son, beloved. He did not raise his hand. He did not need to. Power rearranged itself in the world. In my stead, he said, Warmaster. The title fell like a seal. In that instant, the galaxy's chain of command tightened into a fist with Horus for its knuckle. The cheer that followed shook spires, rattled the teeth in the heads of remembrancers clutching their pick tools, sent flocking birds into panic spirals above the parade ground. Some primarchs clapped with true warmth, some clapped because anything else would be remembered, but all watched. Horus bowed, one knee, one fist to the stone, head lowered not as a servant, but as a sword laid flat. When he rose, his face was calm, and only those who knew him best saw the thing beneath the calm, a shock like cold water, the comprehension of weight. He smiled then, not the loose brotherly glint of the Lupercal camaraderie, but a precise, almost private curve of the mouth, as if accepting not a gift, but a debt he intended to pay in full. The triumph unspooled into its created revels, lauded duels, oaths renewed, vaults opened to reveal captured or grotesqueries, a banquet whose table ran like roads. Horus moved among it all as gravity made flesh. Sanguinius embraced him with honest joy. Fulgrim's congratulations came polished to a mirror's bright edge. Gilliman's was a strategist descent, weighed and filed. The lion's courtesy was a door open just enough to pass through. Percherobbo measured the architecture of the day and found it flawless, which displeased him. Angron ate and brooded, his laughter too sharp at the edges. Mortarion stood at the perimeter, air souring around him at the thought of psychers in the crowd. Lorgar looked upon the Emperor as others looked upon stars. When the last hymn faded, the Emperor made a quieter announcement, couched in the language of inevitability. He would return to Terra to pursue matters of ultimate consequence. The Great Crusade would go on under Horus's hand. A council of Terra, administrators, logisticians, savants, would govern the civil machinery in his absence. Malcador would oversee the centre, while Horus carried the blade to the rim. The words were neat, their consequences were not. In the weeks that followed, the Warmaster's work began in earnest. The 16th Legion's flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, became a mobile capital. Orders went out not as suggestions, but as harmonics meant to bring 18 disparate symphonies into tune. Expedition fleets received revised compliance protocols that married mercy to speed. Accept surrender swiftly, encode the tithe obligations cleanly, install secular governance that could stand without constant Astartes' shadow. Astartes were blades, not garrisons. Horus would not spend them as locks for doors other men could not learn to bolt. He convened war councils that were part strategy, part theatre, a circle where brothers could contest doctrine without contesting blood. In those chambers, he conceded where he could, press where he must. To the Iron Warriors, he gave siege objectives that would challenge and flatter. To the Raven Guard, long-range interdictions where subtlety was a decisive flank. To the World Eaters, short wars where fury could be pointed like a spear instead of smashed like a rock. To the Ultramarines, administration of complex sectors whose stability would multiply victories long after a fleet burned to the next sky. He did not command as a tyrant, he conducted. Within his own legion, the Mournival gathered close, Abaddon's iron certainty, Togadon's laughing candour, Little Horus Aximan's cool calibration, and Garviel Loken's freshly earned steadiness. They argued before their primarch because that was their function. They told him truths at angles that would cut softer coming from them than a brother prince. They spoke of pride among the legions, of the old rivalries that could fracture task forces at the wrong moment, of the first tremors of resentment at taking orders from a brother instead of a father. Horus listened. He had always listened. He sent private vox to certain brothers, praise wrapped around a request, respect acknowledged before an instruction laid down. He wrote to Gilliman in the language of logistics and law. He wrote to Dawn in the lexicon of duty and stone. He wrote to Sanguinius in a voice that needed no translation. He wrote to the lion briefly and without ornament, because ornament only annoyed the lion. The Warmaster did not mistake victory for virtue. He knew that men, even demigods, wanted to be seen. The Remembrancer Order, newly sanctioned to chronicle the Crusade, arrived like pollen on the fleet air. Painters set up easels in the hangar bays. Poets squinted at Astartes and tried to find metaphors big enough. Historians elbowed logisticians on viewing decks as if words could be issued out of a magazine. Many officers hated it. Horus did not. He understood the uses of a story. He let the Remembrancers paint and write, and he made sure they saw the things he wanted to remember. A lunar wolf lifting a mortal child onto his armoured shoulder at a compliance ceremony. A forge-wright shaking hands with a voidsman in front of a newly lit power spire. A conquered general given a seat at the table instead of a noose. He was making more than a war. He was making consent. And yet, as the months turned, tension cooled in the space between the Warmaster's bridge and Terra's marble corridors. The Council of Terra drafted directives whose edge bit without knowing they were blades. Tithe schedules took no notice of how many regiments a world had bled to buy its compliance. They asked for grain by the ton and ore by the cubic metre in a season when weather did not care for ledgers. Administrators quibbled over the correct sigil for a newly compliant prefecture, while Astartes cleaned orc residue from their armour. Petitioners queued in halls to argue debt ratios, while captains in distant orbits shaped maps with blood. Horus felt the drag. He did not shout. He wrote. He negotiated. He delayed when delay saved lives and pushed when speed would prevent greater losses later. He sent Malcador long, precise dispatches that read like minutes of a philosopher's council and the threat assessments of a soldier who had learned where things fracture. The sigillite replied with the tolerance of an old man who had seen other empires snap under less. Between them, the Imperium did not tear. Not yet. There were other frictions. Some brothers chafed openly. Percherabo built perfect bridges over rivers no one needed to cross and stared at orders as if they were insults. Angron wanted his wars to be all wars. Horus found him arenas vast enough to keep his attention and short enough to prevent him from burning the crops after the battle. Kerr's muttered prophecy edged like broken glass and vanished into the shadow before anyone could hold him to a plan. Mortarian's contempt for psychers congealed into policy where he could make it so. Lorgar smiled too much and spoke too softly for a man whose legion had been forced to kneel in the ashes of a city they loved. Horus smoothed what he could, redirected what he could not, and remembered what he could neither smooth nor redirect. A Warmaster does not forget where stresses live. He files them like a ship's engineer marks a hairline crack in an overtaxed hull. Noted, monitored, dangerous if ignored. He worked. He slept in hours, not nights. He walked the casualty decks without herald, learning names he would never speak aloud again. He drilled with his sons and laughed with them as if laughter were an oath binding different kinds of men into one. In his private moments, few and unguarded, he looked out through the Vengeful Spirit's armoured glass at starfields who had fought to make friendly, and felt the shape of obligation that had replaced the easy joy of a prince of war. The galaxy was no longer the Emperor's to take, it was his to finish. There is the difference. The orders kept coming, the fleets kept burning. On a dozen frontiers, the Warmaster's touch could be felt in a way a compliance took a week instead of a month, in the way a governor signed willingly instead of at bolt pistol point, in the way a brother primarch wrote back with assent instead of argument. The Crusade sped up by increments that would look like miracles to later historians hunting for turning points. And somewhere between Ullanor's parade ground and the next nameless muster field, the laughter in the 16th wardroom grew a little louder, the toast a little longer. The Lunar Wolves were proud before. Now they carried pride that came from being the hand of the hand, the legion that bore the weight of the rest. It was a pride that could lift a fleet over a mountain. It was also a pride that, if mishandled, could crack a mountain in the wrong direction. Horus knew that too. When he lay down at last, he did so like a soldier who had learned to sleep inside his armour. The title had set upon him fully. It did not crush him. It did not leave him. It remade him into the only thing the Imperium needed him to be. Warmaster, beloved, responsible for everything that would follow. The Great Crusade had been many things to many sons. To Horus it was the proving ground of command. To Guilliman, the laboratory of order. To Angron, an endless arena. But to Lorgar Aurelian, 17th son of the Emperor, it was a pulpit. Every compliance, every banner unfurled, was for him another chapter in the scripture he believed he was helping to write. For Lorgar, the Imperium was not merely a state, it was a faith. From the first day he bent the knee, Lorgar named the Emperor God. The word-bearers carved cathedrals where the legions were meant to build garrisons, raised monuments when the order was to raise granaries. Their compliance world sang hymns before they learned tithe rates. To Lorgar, conquest without worship was scaffolding without a temple. He loved the Emperor not as a father, not even as a sovereign, but as the centre of creation, and in that love lay the roots of disaster. The Emperor had tolerated much from his other sons. Angron's bloody excess, Percherabo's sullen bitterness, even Kerr's nihilistic cruelty, but he had no tolerance for religion. The Imperial truth was the foundation of the Crusade. There were no gods, only mankind and its reason. To allow even one legion to undermine that principle was to risk everything. So the Emperor acted with merciless clarity. In 906.M30, the word-bearers were ordered to gather at Kerr, their shining jewel. Upon its surface stood Monarchia, the so-called Perfect City, a cathedral world built by the 17th Legion in honour of the Emperor. Its spires scraped the firmament, its plazas held millions in worshipful throngs. It was the purest expression of Lorgar's devotion, and the site of his greatest humiliation. The Emperor descended with his custodians, and at his side, the 13th Legion. Guilliman's Ultramarines ringed the city with iron precision. Under the Master of Mankind's command, Monarchia was annihilated, its spires were toppled, its sanctuaries torn down by orbital bombardment, its people driven out beneath the cold eyes of gold-armoured guardians. Then, in the ashes of what had been his pride, Lorgar and his legion were forced to kneel before their father. The Emperor's words were knives. They had wasted time on worship when the galaxy needed conquest. They had mistaken reverence for progress. They had been found wanting. Guilliman, practical as ever, enforced the edict with pitiless efficiency. The word-bearers, Legion of Zeal, bowed their heads in the dirt while their temples burned around them. The sight seared itself into their memory. Lorgar rose from that humiliation changed. His faith in the Emperor remained, but it curdled into something more complex. If his father refused divinity, then what had their visions meant? What was that heat he felt in his soul when he looked upon the stars? It was then when the Whispers found him. Guided by his first chaplain Erebus and his trusted apostle Corferon, Lorgar set out on a pilgrimage, not of conquest, but of revelation. The word-bearers' fleet diverted into forbidden regions, the Eye of Terror. They haunted warp storms where the veil between realities thinned. There, Lorgar found answers. The primordial truth, the voice of the Chaos Gods, reached out to him. They were old, they were vast, and they promised him meaning. Where the Emperor had offered only rejection, the warp offered affirmation. These were gods that wanted worship, gods that responded to faith. Lorgar listened, and in listening, he fell. When he returned from that journey, his sermons were quieter but more dangerous. Outwardly, he obeyed. The word-bearers built fortresses instead of cathedrals, planted standards instead of shrines. But beneath the surface, their chaplains spread new practices. Small warrior lodges within the legions, sworn brotherhoods bound not by duty but by secrets. They preached unity, camaraderie, freedom from rigid command, and always, at their root, was the seed of chaos. It was not a swift corruption, it was a patient one. A lodge might begin as nothing more than a mess hall circle where brothers spoke their minds without fear of censure, but gifts were exchanged. Talismans of unmarked origin, words whispered that warmed the heart strangely. Veterans returned from campaigns with tales of visions that sharpened their will, of powers that made their bolter round strike truer. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the lodges spread. By the time the Great Crusade neared its zenith, there were lodges in nearly every legion, some innocuous, some already half sworn to the primordial truth. And always at the centre was Erebus. He moved quietly, a shadow among giants, but his hand was everywhere. He flattered Fulgrim's hunger for perfection, murmured sympathy to Angron's endless rage, lent Mortarion words to sharpen his contempt for psychers. He prepared tools and waited. For the greatest tool of all, he set his sights on Horus himself. The path to that corruption was not immediate. Horus was too beloved, too strong, to be tempted by whispers alone. He needed to be wounded, body and spirit, brought to the brink where faith and despair collided. Erebus sought such an opportunity, and when he found it, he held it ready as a dagger beneath his cloak. Meanwhile, Lorgar's legion carried out the Emperor's will with renewed fervour, and none suspected the depth of their heresy. But every compliance was now a quiet desecration. Colonies seeded with chaos cults, shrines hidden in underhives, chaplains who spoke the words of imperial truth in daylight and the primordial truth in shadow. Lorgar himself became both missionary and conspirator. To his brothers, he played the role of a loyal son, penitent, chastised, grateful for the Emperor's correction. Inwardly, he plotted. He had seen the truth the Emperor denied, and he meant to bring others to it. That was the paradox of Lorgar. He believed himself a traitor. He did not think he was betraying the Imperium. He thought he was saving it, from the silence at its heart, from a god who would not admit he was a god, from the hollowness of reason without faith. In his eyes, chaos was not corruption, it was revelation. So when Horus was raised to Warmaster in Ullanor, Lorgar smiled and applauded with the rest, but behind his eyes, he knew the Warmaster's pride, his burden, his isolation, would make him vulnerable, and Erebus already carried the weapon that would break him, a cursed blade stolen from a distant culture, one that could pierce even a primarch's flesh. The stage was set. The word-bearers had embraced chaos, they had spread its rot through the legions, and their greatest work was yet to come. For the moment, the galaxy still marched under the banner of unity, the Emperor still sat on the throne of terror, and Horus still bore the trust of all his brothers. But beneath it all, in the ashes of Monarchia, the first true betrayal had already been written. The Warmaster had been tested 100 times in battle, but never in the soul. That trial came not on a field of triumph, but on a swamp world reeking of rotten old betrayal, Davin. The planet was an unremarkable sphere of mud and ruin, until rebellion kindled there. A former Imperial governor, Eugene Tember, once loyal, had turned his banner against the Imperium. Such uprisings were not rare. What made this one different was the invisible hand behind it, Erebus of the Word-Bearers, who had seeded the revolt with something far fouler than politics. Davin was bait, and Horus, newly named Warmaster, took it. The 63rd expedition descended in force, legionaries in their thousands. The sons of Horus cut through resistance like scythes through chaff. Yet as they advanced into the swamplands, the foe changed. Soldiers fought on with wounds that should have killed them. Corpses walked again, eyes lit with a sick green light. The land itself seemed hostile. Foul waters dragged down tanks, fogs that whispered the names of the dead. The Warmaster pressed forward nonetheless, determined to confront the traitor governor himself. In the ruins of Tembur's fortress, Horus found his quarry. But Tembur no longer resembled a man. His body was bloated with corruption, his arms swollen with unnatural muscle, his skin cracked with veins of black ichor. In his hands he carried a blade that pulsed with malevolent life, the anathema, a Xenos-forged weapon stolen and delivered into his grip by Erebus's design. Horus struck. The duel was swift, brutal, but not without cost. In the final exchange, the anathema cut deep. It pierced armour, it pierced flesh, and worse, it pierced the Warmaster's gene-forged resilience. The wound festered instantly, black veins spreading out like lightning trapped beneath the skin. Horus felled Tembur in wrath, but the victory tasted of ashes. Moments later, the Warmaster collapsed, his lifeblood poisoned by something that no apothecary, no medicae, no healing art could stop. Panic swept the 63rd expedition. The Warmaster, the Emperor's chosen heir, lay dying. Apothecaries laboured in desperation. Legionaries stood in hushed silence. Then Erebus stepped forward with the calm of a man who already knew its outcome. He spoke of an ancient Daemonic temple, a place of healing older than human settlement, where rituals of salvation might be performed. To most, it sounded like desperation. To Horus's captains, facing the death of their primarch, it sounded like hope. Reluctantly, they carried Horus's failing body into the Serpent Lodge. What happened within was not medicine, it was sorcery. The Warmaster's soul was drawn from his body, cast adrift in the warp. His warriors could not see it, but they felt it, the air thick with whispers, the walls weeping with unseen eyes. The Chaos Gods had been waiting. In that place beyond reality, Horus beheld visions. He saw an Imperium where the Emperor ruled as a god, demanding worship he had always denied. He saw humanity shackled by bureaucracy, the Council of Terra fat with power, while his own name was forgotten, his sacrifices erased. The gods spoke as if they were victims, betrayed by the Emperor's arrogance. They showed Horus a galaxy where only he, not his father, could bring true unity, where he could be the saviour, not the shadow. The visions twisted truth and lie until they were indistinguishable. Horus saw what he feared most, being cast aside, his loyalty repaid with irrelevance, his brothers remembered while he was lost in the margins. And then came the offer. Give us the Emperor, lead mankind to freedom, and the galaxy will be yours. Horus hesitated. The man who had fought beside the Emperor for decades still lived within him, but the poison of the anathema had already weakened more than his body. Pride and resentment gnawed at the wound. He thought of monarchy as ruins, of the Emperor returning to Terra in secret, of the Council replacing warriors with bureaucrats. He thought of the burden laid upon him at Ullanor. An honour, yes, but also a chain. And into that chasm of doubt, the Chaos Gods poured their promise. In that moment, Magnus the Red intruded. Across the Immaterium, the Crimson King reached into the Lodge's ritual, risking everything to warn his brother. He pleaded with Horus to resist, to see the trap for what it was. But Horus, already swayed, saw only manipulation. He believed Magnus part of the deceit, another voice trying to bind him to the future he no longer trusted. So Horus chose. He bent the knee not to the Emperor, but to the primordial powers. He accepted their gifts, their strength, their destiny. The bargain sealed, the poison receded, the wound closed, and the Warmaster rose again, his body healed, his heart blackened. When he emerged from the Serpent Lodge, the warriors of the 63rd knelt in relief and reverence. They believed their Gene Father saved by miracle. None knew the cost. Only Erebus smiled knowingly, for the trap had sprung. From that day, Horus was no longer the Emperor's chosen heir. He was the champion of Chaos Undivided. His transformation was not immediately revealed. Outwardly, Horus carried on as before, issuing orders, prosecuting campaigns. But subtle changes rippled outward. He renamed the Lunar Wolves the Sons of Horus, severing their past to bind them to himself. Warrior lodges that had once been innocent cults of brotherhood suddenly grew bold, speaking openly of new truths. Captains once uncertain found themselves compelled by strange fervour. Most chilling, Horus began to whisper to his brothers. To Fulgrim, he spoke of perfection unchained, of a destiny greater than servitude. To Angron, he promised endless war, a galaxy aflame in which no master could leash him. To Mortarion, he described the liberation from the Emperor's hypocrisy, a world where psychers and witchcraft would no longer be forced upon him. And to Lorgar, he gave gratitude, for it was Lorgar's vision that had set him upon this path. One by one, through persuasion, pride or promise, the Warmaster gathered allies. Some were convinced, some were coerced, some were simply glad to strike at the Emperor they believed had betrayed them long ago. Meanwhile, in the Sanctum of Terra, the Emperor sensed only fragments of the truth. What reached him was Magnus's desperate psychic warning, a message delivered by breaking the very Edict of Nicaea. Magnus's astral form tore through the walls of the Imperial Palace, shouting of Horus's fall, but in doing so, he shattered the Emperor's secret work, the Webway Project, a hidden gate beneath the palace itself. Demons poured forth, consuming years of labour in moments. The Emperor was forced to turn his wrath not upon Horus, but upon Magnus. The Thousand Sons would pay for their primarch's disobedience, even as the true traitor gathered strength unchecked. Horus's corruption had succeeded in more than breaking his own loyalty. It had turned brother against brother, and drawn the Emperor's gaze away from the real threat. Thus did a single wound on a swamp world fester into a mortal blow against the Imperium. Horus rose from Davin not as the Emperor's most trusted son, but as his greatest enemy. The galaxy did not know it yet, but the heresy had begun. When Magnus the Red tore his way through the warp to warn the Emperor of Horus's corruption, he believed he was saving his father. Instead, he doomed his legion. The psychic blast of his intrusion had ripped open the wards beneath the Imperial Palace, tearing apart the Emperor's Webway Project and letting demons surge into the heart of Terra itself. For the Emperor, the warning was not seen as loyalty, it was betrayal. His judgment was swift. The Crimson King had broken the Edict of Nicaea, disobeying the council that had banned sorcery among the legions. The Emperor could no longer overlook the Thousand Sons' obsession with the warp. He gave orders for Magnus to be brought to Terra to answer for his crimes. To carry out that sentence, he dispatched Leman Russ, the Wolf King, and his Space Wolves. But treachery twisted even this. Horus, already fallen into the service of chaos, intercepted the Emperor's command. Where the Master of Mankind had ordered Russ to arrest Magnus, Horus whispered a different word into the Wolf's ear: destroy. The Wolves were unleashed. The fleet that bore down on Prospero, the jewel of the Thousand Sons, was not merely the 6th Legion. With the Wolves came the Sisters of Silence, null maidens whose very presence poisoned psychic energy, and the Emperor's own custodians, his Golden Warriors. They did not come to negotiate. They came with virus bombs primed and firestorm torpedoes loaded. Prospero was a world of scholars, artists, and towering spires of glass and gold. Its capital, Tizca, was a city of wonders, pyramids that touched the clouds, libraries containing knowledge gathered since the Age of Strife, and streets where sorcerers debated beneath the shadow of their primarch's great observatory. The Thousand Sons had built a paradise of intellect and beauty. That paradise was about to be turned to ash. When the Space Wolves arrived in orbit, Magnus knew. He had foreseen this moment in shards of prophecy, though he had hoped that the path might be turned. Grief hollowed him. He did not prepare his legions for war. Instead, he forbade them from raising arms, declaring that he alone would face judgment. Magnus, resigned, believed that perhaps sacrifice could atone for his mistake. But the Wolves were not coming to take him alive. The first salvos fell from the void, and Prospero's skies ignited. Virus bombs burst, oceans boiled, and the Great Pyramids trembled under the pounding of orbital strikes. In an instant, Magnus's passivity shattered. The Thousand Sons, who had sworn to obey, could no longer stand idle while their world burned. Azek Araman, chief librarian, rallied his brothers. Sorcerers raised psychic shields to stave off bombardments. Crimson armoured warriors prepared for ground war. Prospero would not die without resistance. The Space Wolves descended in their thousands, howling with battle fury. Their gene-sire, Leman Russ, led from the front, a towering figure clad in furs and iron, wielding the blade of the Emperor himself. Around him strode packs of his fiercest sons, Fenrisian wolves at their heels, eager for slaughter. They made no distinction between warrior and civilian. To the wolves, all of Prospero was guilty. The battle that followed was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Sorcery against savagery, Thousand Sons unleashed bolts of psychic flame, walls of force, storms of lightning. They summoned guardians of shimmering energy, constructs of dust and light to turn back the tide. The wolves answered with raw brutality, bolter and fang, chainblade and axe. The Sisters of Silence advanced at their heart, their null auras snuffing out psychic powers, reducing mighty sorcerers to choking helpless men. Tizca's avenues became rivers of blood. The wolves tore through palaces, temples and libraries, leaving corpses in their wake. The Thousand Sons fought back with all their arcane might. Whole buildings were transmuted into weapons, statues of gold animated to crush invaders, storms of warp fire consumed squads of space wolves, but for every warrior slain, 2 more pressed forward. The wolves would not relent. Amid the carnage, the primarchs met. On the steps of the Great Pyramid, Leman Russ confronted Magnus the Red. Once, they had been brothers, each respecting their brother in their own way. Now, they were executioner and condemned. Magnus towered above Russ, his skin alight with psychic radiance, his cyclopean eye blazing with sorrow and rage. Russ, smaller but forged from iron will, snarled his father's command, though in truth, it was Horus's lie he carried. The duel was apocalyptic. Magnus hurled waves of psychic might, storms that cracked the sky and split the ground. Rust charged through them, his blade tearing apart wards, his fury unstoppable. They fought from spire to spire, their blows shattering towers, their roars echoing across a burning city. To witnesses, it was less a battle of men than of gods. At last, the Wolf King struck true. With a mighty swing, Rust shattered Magnus's body, breaking the Crimson King's back. The Primarch of Prospero fell, crippled and weeping, unable to stand against his brother's strength. In that moment, despair overcame him. He saw no salvation, no forgiveness, no future for himself or his sons, and so Magnus turned to the very power he had always sought to master, never to serve. With the final act of sorcery, he opened a rift in reality and hurled what remained of his legion into the warp. The Thousand Sons vanished from Prospero, carried away to the planet of the sorcerers within the Eye of Terror, a sanctuary and a prison. When the smoke cleared, Prospero was no more. Tizca was a graveyard of glass and ruin, its once great libraries burned to cinders, its streets buried in ash. The Space Wolves howled their victory, the Sisters of Silence marked their task complete, and Leman Russ, though bloody and unbowed, felt the weight of something broken beyond repair. The Emperor's will had been perverted by Horus's lie, but the deed was done. The Thousand Sons were gone, their loyalty destroyed, their Primarch broken in body and spirit. The Imperium had lost one of its most brilliant legions, not to neglect or rebellion, but to misunderstanding and pride. Magnus would never again serve the Emperor. His heart, already scarred by humiliation at Nicaea, now burned with bitterness and fury. In his exile within the Eye of Terror, he gave himself over fully to the Chaos God Tzeentch, Lord of Sorcery. The Crimson King, once a seeker of knowledge and enlightenment, became a demon Primarch, and master of the very powers the Emperor had sought to forbid. The burning of Prospero was more than a destruction of a world. It was the death of trust between brothers, the confirmation that heresy could not be contained. The Wolves had done their work well, but in doing so they had driven another son into Horus's waiting arms. The ashes of Tizca whispered the truth. The Imperium was no longer a family, it was a battlefield, and the war had only just begun. The mask slipped at last. Horus, champion of the Emperor no longer, bared his treachery not with words, but with fire. The first open stroke of the heresy came upon the blood-soaked fields of Isstvan III. It was here brother turned upon brother, and a generation of warriors learned that loyalty was a death sentence. The planet was a festering wound of rebellion. Its rulers had renounced imperial compliance, raising banners of independence. On the surface, it seemed another routine war of pacification. Horus declared he would personally see the planet brought back to heel, a gesture of strength for the Warmaster's reputation. In truth, Isstvan was not about rebellion, it was about purge. Among the sons of Horus, the Emperor's children, the Death Guard, and the World Eaters still beat the hearts of warriors loyal to Terra. Whole companies of Astartes refused the seductions of Erebus's lodges, refused whispers of doubt, and held fast to their oaths. They were obstacles, too dangerous to confront directly, too proud to be quietly disposed of. Horus's solution was elegant in cruelty. Send them to the surface under the pretense of honour. Bid them cleanse Isstvan III, then burn them alive. The Loyalists descended in strength. Garviel Loken of the Sons of Horus led his company with grim pride, unaware of the danger poised at his back. Captain Sol Tarvitz of the Emperor's Children commanded his warriors, disciplined and unshakable. Elements of the Death Guard and World Eaters deployed with equal conviction, believing themselves chosen for the Warmaster's confidence. They struck the rebel cities with bolter and blade, scouring Isstvan's streets in righteous fury. Then the sky fell. From orbit, the traitor fleets unleashed hell. Virus bombs rained down upon the world. Buildings, forests, oceans, every living thing was reduced to slurry and ash as the life-eater toxin spread. In minutes, Isstvan III was a carnal planet, its air thick with corrosive plague. Cities that had stood for millennia became tombs of bubbling ooze. The Loyalists, fighting in the ruins, realised too late the betrayal. Their armour seals saved some, but the world itself was poisoned against them. It should have ended there, but fate had a different script. Captain Sol Tarvitz, quicker to understand than most, seized a vox and screamed warnings across every Loyalist channel. He begged them into bunkers, into the depths, into any shelter that might withstand the inferno to come. His message, carried on battlefield frequencies, saved thousands. The Loyalists endured as the virus fire consumed the planet above them. Enraged that his treachery had not annihilated them, Horus turned to the next phase. He ordered orbital bombardment, flame and iron to scour even the survivors. But when the guns opened, something unexpected happened. A rift cracked open within the legions themselves. Not every warrior aboard the traitor fleet had consented to this betrayal. Some still clung to honour. They sabotaged fire missions, delayed orders, and in secret, smuggled messages down to the surface. What was meant to be a swift extermination became a grinding, merciless war. On Isstvan's ruined streets, loyalist and traitor met face to face. No longer hidden, no longer uncertain, the heresy was unveiled in bolter-fire and chainsaw teeth. Garviel Loken, his faith shattered but his will unbroken, led his battered sons of Horus in street-to-street resistance. Tarvit, steadfast even in despair, organised defences that held far longer than the Warmaster anticipated. Death Guard captains like Nathaniel Garrow, refusing to yield, fought beside them. And in the madness the World Eaters split, some falling into frothing allegiance to Angron, others standing with their brothers to the last. The traitors pressed down in overwhelming strength. Eidolon of the Emperor's children, exulting in cruelty, led assault waves that tore through shelters. Death Guard under Calas Typhon spread pestilence with grim precision. The World Eaters, unleashed by Angron himself, hacked apart anything in their path with butcher's nails singing in their skulls. And above it all, Horus watched, cold and calculating, as his plan devoured friend and foe alike. The war was apocalyptic. Loyalists held the Ezekarian stronghold for weeks against impossible odds. Their bolters ran dry. They fought with blades, with fists, with anything they had. Every hour bought by their defiance gave time for word of Horus's treachery to spread. Their sacrifice was more than survival, it was warning. One by one, the heroes of Isstvan fell. Loken, last seen beneath a collapsing Habdome, fought until the world itself buried him. Tarvit, who had defied the Warmaster with nothing but a voxcall, stood his ground until firestorms consumed him. Their names became watchwords for loyalty, whispered by survivors carried off-world in secret. But Horus's will was done. The loyalist companies were annihilated, their bloodline excised from the legions. The first culling of the Astartes was complete. From the ashes, the traitor legions emerged leaner, more unified in corruption. They had proven their willingness to butcher their own. There would be no turning back. Yet in victory lay the Warmaster's final wound. The massacre had not been clean. Too many had escaped. Nathaniel Garrow, Death Guard captain, stole away aboard the frigate Eisenstein. With him a handful of survivors who bore the truth of Isstvan to Terra. Their flight through warp and fire would carry the alarm that Horus had hoped to silence. By the time the smoke cleared, Isstvan III was a grave world. No cities, no life, only bones and ash and the echo of bolter fire. But the galaxy had changed forever. Trust was dead. The dream of the Great Crusade lay in ruins. The legions, once brothers, were now two armies. Loyalists fighting for a distant emperor and traitors fighting for a future written in shadow. The heresy had crossed its first threshold. The mask was gone. Horus had declared war upon the Imperium in the language of annihilation, and the galaxy would never know peace again. Isstvan III had been a culling, a test of loyalty, a quiet purge disguised as compliance. But it was only the beginning. Horus had not raised his hand against Terra yet, but he could not challenge the Emperor outright. He had to shatter those brothers who remained loyal, and break the legions that still stood with them. That reckoning came not in whispers or bombardment, but in the most infamous betrayal of the Age of Darkness, the drop site massacre of Isstvan V. After the atrocity on Isstvan III, word of Horus's treachery spread. The Eisenstein carried Garrow and his survivors to Terra, and the Emperor could no longer deny what had happened. Horus, the Warmaster, had turned. The Imperium's response was swift and massive. 7 legions were committed to the counterstrike, tasked with ending the rebellion before it consumed the galaxy. The first wave comprised of 3, the Iron Hands under Ferrus Manus, the Salamanders led by Vulcan, and the Raven Guard commanded by Corvus Corax. They were to strike Isstvan V directly, engage Horus and his traitor legions, and hold the line until 4 more loyal legions arrived as reinforcement. It was meant to be a hammer blow, a coordinated strike to crush rebellion in its infancy. Instead, it became a carnal ground. The Loyalist spearhead descended upon the blackened plains of the Urgal Depression, a vast basin surrounded by jagged mountains. It was there that Horus arrayed his forces, fortifications dug deep, weapon batteries bristling, legions waiting like predators in the dust. The Loyalists knew it would be brutal, but they trusted the Emperor's plan. Overwhelm Horus with numbers, cut off his head, and end the war before it truly began. At first, the battle favoured them. Ferrus Manus drove his Iron Hands into the front ranks with the fury of a storm, his hammer forge breaker smashing traitors like kindling. Vulcan, indomitable and unyielding, led his salamanders through the blood and fire, each blow a hymn to resilience. And Corax, the Shadow Hawk, used speed and precision to carve gaps in the traitor lines, his Raven Guard striking like knives in the dark. For hours, the battle raged. Loyalist banners pushed forward, the traitors' lines bent under the assault. Some even whispered that Horus's gamble had failed, that the Warmaster had misjudged the Emperor's wrath. But Horus had not misjudged, he had planned. When the reinforcement wave came, it should have been salvation. The Iron Warriors, the Alpha Legion, the Night Lords, and the Word Bearers made planetfall in strength. To the embattled loyalists, their arrival was a godsend. 4 legions to reinforce 3, the tide turning at last. The loyalists raised their banners high, their primarchs shouted commands with renewed hope. Victory seemed not only possible, but certain. Then the betrayal was revealed. The 4 legions, sworn to loyalty, turned their guns not upon Horus, but upon their own brothers. From the flanks and rear, the Iron Warriors opened fire on the Salamanders. The Night Lords fell upon the Raven Guard with predatory savagery, howling through the ranks like wolves among sheep. The Alpha Legion, inscrutable and merciless, struck wherever the Loyalists were weakest, sowing chaos with precise malice. And the Word-bearers, mouths dripping with dark litanies, slaughtered in the name of gods not yet dared name aloud. The trap closed, the Urgal depression became a pit of slaughter. Primarch met Primarch in the chaos. Ferrus Manus, filled with incandescent rage, sought out his brother Fulgrim, Primarch of the Emperor's Children. Their duel was titanic, the hammer Forgebreaker against the blade Fireblade, each strike echoing across the battlefield, but Fulgrim had already fallen deep into the grip of chaos. He fought with speed and artistry Ferrus had never seen. In the end, Fulgrim struck his brother down, severing his head with a blade's whisper. The Iron Hands broke in grief, their gene sire gone, their fury spent in hopeless retaliation. Vulcan, surrounded and outnumbered, was brought low not by one brother but by many. Mortally wounded, his body was dragged away in captivity, a prize for the traitors. He would endure torments unending, for Vulcan's resilience was more than flesh, it was a curse of immortality. Corvus Corax escaped, but only barely. The Raven Guard were butchered in their thousands, their Primarch carving a bloody path through the Night Lords to snatch survival from annihilation. His legion, once proud, was reduced to scattered remnants. Corax would never forgive himself for bringing his sons into that pit. The massacre raged for a single day, yet its wounds bled for centuries. Tens of thousands of Astartes lay dead. The plains of Isstvan V became a graveyard of broken armour and blackened banners. Corpses piled high in a wasteland of betrayal. Loyalist legions that had stood proud for 2 centuries of conquest were reduced to shadows of themselves. But worse than the slaughter was the truth it revealed. The heresy was no longer Horus's rebellion alone. It was half the legions of the Imperium, united in betrayal. Brother against brother, son against father, the Great Crusade, built over 2 centuries of blood and fire, was dead. In its place stood a civil war on a scale the galaxy had never seen. The survivors carried the horror with them. The Iron Hands splintered, leaderless and shattered by their Primarch's death. The Salamanders, broken and scattered, clung to their gene-sized legacy even as he was torn from them. The Raven Guard limped into the void, Corax grim and silent, his heart a stone of guilt. And the traitors exulted. Horus's plan had succeeded perfectly. In one stroke, he had cooled the Imperium's strength, eliminated its most dangerous legions, and proven that loyalty itself was a weakness to be exploited. From that day, the Warmaster's path to Terra lay open, paved with the bones of his brothers. For the Imperium, the Dropsite massacre was more than defeat, it was revelation. The Emperor now faced not 1 traitor legion, but 8. The war would not be short, it would not be clean, it would not be merciful. Isstvan V was a turning point. It was that moment that heresy ceased to be whispers and became apocalypse. The smoke rising from the Urgal depression was not only the funeral pyre of Ferrus Manus, or the death cry of 3 legions, it was the death knell of the dream of unity. From here, the galaxy plunged into nightmare. The massacre at Isstvan V had shattered more than legions. It had shattered the dream of unity itself. No longer could anyone believe this was a rebellion contained to a few disgruntled warlords, nor a momentary fracture in the Emperor's design. The Warmaster's treachery was unveiled in full, and with it came the unravelling of the galaxy. The heresy was no longer a conspiracy, it was war, civil war on a scale beyond comprehension. In the wake of Isstvan, the Imperium found itself broken in half. 8 legions now stood with Horus, the Sons of Horus, World Eaters, Death Guard, Emperor's Children, Word-bearers, Night Lords, Alpha Legion, and the Iron Warriors. Their fleets prowled like predators loose from the leash, striking without restraint, cutting off vital arteries of trade and communication. Opposing them were those who still clung to loyalty. Raven Guard, Salamanders, and the Iron Hands, devastated and scattered from Isstvan. White Scars, torn between allegiances. Dark Angels, pursuing wars of their own far from Terra. And the mighty Ultramarines, bloodied in Ultramar but still standing. The legions loyal to the Emperor were fewer, fractured, and beset on all fronts. The balance of power tipped towards the Warmaster. The Emperor commanded terror and its defences, but Horus commanded momentum, initiative, and above all, fear. As the traitors advanced, the galaxy itself seemed to rebel. The Ruin Storm, a warped maelstrom birthed by the atrocities of Lorgar and Angron, tore the stars apart. It grew like a malignant wound, cutting the Imperium in two. Fleets attempting to cross vanished without trace. Astropathic choirs screamed until their throats bled. Whole sectors went dark, isolated from terror as though swallowed by night. The Emperor's great project, unity through the Imperial truth, collapsed under this storm. Faith faltered. Worlds, cut off and desperate, turned to their own defences, some swearing to Horus, others to darker gods whose name they had once feared to speak. The galaxy, once painstakingly stitched together by the Great Crusade, now unravelled thread by thread. Horus pressed this advantage. Where once compliance had been the Imperium's mission, now annihilation was the Warmaster's creed. Loyalist garrisons were hunted down and destroyed in their strongholds. Strategic supply hubs were stripped bare or corrupted into staging points for traitor fleets. The Loyalist legions found themselves fighting not to conquer, but to simply survive. The World Eaters, driven by Angron's insatiable rage, descended on defenceless worlds, slaughtering civilians wholesale and leaving only ruin. The Death Guard, under Mortarion, turned entire star systems into pestilent wastelands, spreading plagues that even Astartes' armour could not stop. The Night Lords seeded terror wherever they went. Their primarch Conrad Kurz turned fear itself into a weapon, leaving crucified corpses as warnings to all who defied them. Each traitor legion carved its own kingdom of horror, and through them all, Horus directed the war with cold precision, his fleets always striking where the Imperium was weakest. Loyalist legions reeled. The Raven Guard, decimated at Isstvan, limped back to deliverance with fewer than a fifth of their strength. Corax begged the Emperor for aid and was granted the gene-tech secrets of the Primarch project. Yet this desperate experiment produced monsters as often as it produced warriors, leaving the Raven Guard haunted by their own attempt at rebirth. The Salamanders, broken and leaderless after Vulcan's capture, struggled to remain cohesive. Scattered companies became crusaders without a Primarch, holding to the ideals of mercy and justice even as their numbers dwindled. They became sparks in the darkness, inspiring hope even when they could not achieve victory. The Iron Hands, grief-stricken after Ferrus Manus' death, fragmented into warbands. Some fought with cold mechanical determination, others abandoned all restraint, venting their rage on traitors and civilians alike. Their Primarch's absence left a wound that never healed. Even among those who had not been struck at Isstvan, division festered. The White Scars, caught between loyalties to Terra and old bonds with Horus, hesitated. Jagatai Khan warred against indecision as much as against the traitors, knowing that every moment of hesitation cost lives. The Dark Angels, under Lionel Johnson, pursued their own secret campaigns in the Galactic East, their motives inscrutable even to their allies. Unity, once the Imperium's greatest strength, was gone. Horus did not waste the chaos. He cast himself not as a tyrant, but as a liberator. His agents spread lies and promise across the stars, that the Emperor was no father but a jailer, that Terra sought to enslave its children, that the Warmaster would grant freedom, autonomy, even godhood. Desperate governors and warlords, isolated from Terra, bent the knee to Horus willingly. Some did it out of fear, others out of ambition. Worlds fell without a shot fired, entire fleets defected, even some Titan legions, swayed by ancient pacts with traitor Primarchs, turned their god machines against the Imperium they had once defended. Horus's rebellion was no longer confined to the legions. It was a galactic civil war, drawing in every level of the Imperium's vast machinery: soldiers, merchants, nobles, and civilians. Brother fought brother not just in the Astartes, but in the Imperial army, in the Mechanicum, even the Ecclesiarchy's early priesthoods. Mars itself split in two. The Mechanicum, long bound by oath to Terra, fractured when Fabricator General Kelbor Hal swore allegiance to Horus. Civil war erupted in the Red Planet's forged cities, Skitarii clashing with Skitarii, Titans dueling across blasted deserts, data shrines aflame with corrupted machine code. The Mechanicum became the Dark Mechanicum, a new force unleashed upon the galaxy, their forges dedicated to the dark sciences of the warp. No longer bound by the Emperor's restraints, these heretics forged weapons of obscene design. Demon engines bound within the souls of the damned, war machines fed by living sacrifice, and plagues written into machine code. Mars, cradle of mankind's industry, became the black heart of the traitor war effort. On Terra, the Emperor knew what must come. He could no longer leave the palace. The catastrophe unleashed by Magnus had forced him to labour ceaselessly upon the Golden Throne, sealing the webway breach and holding back the demonic tide. Command of the war fell to Rogel Dawn, Praetorian of Terra. Dawn transformed the Imperial Palace into a fortress the like of which the galaxy had never seen. Mountains were carved into bastions, valleys turned into killing fields, walls raised higher than the cathedrals. Every street of the palace was reworked into a redoubt, every gate a citadel. Terra was no longer merely the cradle of mankind, it was a fortress world, its defences measured in blood and steel. The Emperor's silence weighed heavily. To most of humanity, it seemed their god had retreated, leaving them in the hands of bureaucrats and generals. To the traitors, it was proof that he had abandoned his children, and to the primarchs, it was a wound, a father's absence at the moment of greatest need. Thus the galaxy slid fully into the Age of Darkness. The Great Crusade, once a beacon of human unity, had ended. What followed was a civil war fought across 1,000,000 worlds, where no system was free of suspicion and no army could be trusted. Traitors raised the banner of freedom even as they slaughtered billions. Loyalists fought for the Emperor even as they questioned his silence. Every battle was brother against brother. Every victory was bought with the death of trust. The dream of the Imperium, born in the Unification Wars, tempered in the Great Crusade, and exalted at Ullanor, now drowned in blood. The galaxy was aflame, and at its heart stood Horus, Warmaster turned usurper, drawing all of mankind into his shadow. The Age of Darkness had begun. The heresy had erupted across the stars, but nowhere was its savagery more concentrated than in Ultramar, jewel of order and prosperity. What Horus needed broken was not merely the Ultramarines as a legion, but the idea of Guilliman's empire, 500 worlds governed with efficiency, stability, and loyalty that outshone even terror. If the dream of Ultramar survived, then the Imperium itself might yet survive. So Horus unleashed the twin horrors of fanaticism and fury. He sent Lorgar Aurelian of the Wordbearers and Angron of the World Eaters into Ultramar with one purpose: to burn it to the ground. The Shadow Crusade began with fire and ended with ash. The World Eaters, already half mad from the butcher's nails gnawing in their skulls, fell upon Ultramar's worlds like a plague. They gave no quarter, asked no surrender. Cities were torn down with chain axes, their population scattered into corpses. The Red Angel himself, Angron, marched at the vanguard, every battle a massacre, every victory another step towards self-destruction. Behind them came the Wordbearers, and their slaughter was subtler, but no less ruinous. Lorgar did not merely kill, he corrupted. Where Angron left burning ruins, Lorgar raised blasphemous shrines, inscribing the names of gods no Imperial citizen dared to utter. Entire populations were turned into cults overnight, their despair twisted into worship of chaos. Every atrocity had purpose. Lorgar's sermons were not for mortals alone, but for the fabric of reality itself. Each mass sacrifice, each temple raised in blood, tore open another wound in the Immaterium. The warp bled into real space, and soon the Ruin Storm was born. A warp storm so vast it engulfed whole sectors, choking astropathic communication and severing fleets from Terra. For the Imperium, it was a catastrophe. The Emperor's armies could no longer march to reinforce Ultramar. The Loyalist legions were cut off, adrift in silence. For Horus, it was the perfect veil. Behind the curtain of the Ruin Storm, he moved his fleets freely, striking where Guilliman was weakest. One of the first and most bloodiest strikes came at Armatura, a vital forge world of Ultramar. The Ultramarines had stationed vast reserves there, tanks, munitions, training cadres, but when the Wordbearers and the Word Eaters fell upon it, those stockpiles became traps. Armatura's cities dissolved into street-to-street carnage. Ultramarines, still loyal and disciplined, fought with every reserve of courage. They turned Manufactura into redoubts, basilicas into fortresses, highways into killing fields, but for every company that held a barricade, another was drowned beneath Angron's berserkers. The air rang with the endless howl of chain blades and the roared litanies of Lorgar's dark apostles. The defenders bought Guilliman time, but at a terrible cost. Armatura bled out, its surface blackened, its forges silenced. The planet did not fall in a single night, but when it was over, it was no longer a jewel of Ultramar, it was a tomb. Rabuti Guilliman, so often the strategist, now found himself waging a war he'd never sought, a war of survival. Unlike many of his brothers, he had never underestimated Lorgar. He knew the 17th Legion were dangerous not because of their strength, but because of their patience and faith. Coupled with Angron's fury, they were a storm designed to grind his empire into dust. Yet Guilliman refused to yield. He became a commander of shadows, abandoning the grand strategies of the Great Crusade in favour of ruthless pragmatism. Supply lines were shortened, star systems abandoned if they could not be held, entire planets were sacrificed so others might live. For a Primarch who had once dreamed of order and permanence, it was a torment, but for Ultramar, it was salvation. The Shadow Crusade was not fought solely between legions. Civilians paid the heaviest price. Planetary defence forces crumbled under the first assault, their weapons useless against transhuman fury. Billions were butchered outright, but billions more were left to suffer in occupations where word-bearer priests raised monuments of flesh, and world-eater warbands made sport of slaughter. Refugee columns clogged the void. Entire populations attempted to flee, their vessels hounded and destroyed by traitor patrols. Some were rescued by Ultramarine fleets, but many more vanished into the Ruin Storm, never to be heard from again. The once prosperous heart of Guilliman's realm became a carnal house. Even as Angron delighted in carnage, his body betrayed him. The butcher's nails, the cortical implants that drove him to endless rage, were killing him. With each battle, his physiology degraded. His blood boiled with unnatural fevers, his body seizing under the strain of rage he could not contain. Angron was dying, and he did not care. Lorgar, however, did. He had seen the Ark of Prophecy and knew the Red Angel's fate could serve a greater purpose. Through ritual steeped in the warp, through sacrifice on a scale that beggared imagination, he guided his brother into ascension. On the ashes of a conquered world, Angron shed his flesh and was reborn as a demon prince of Khorne. The howls of his legions shook the stars. The first primarch had crossed fully into damnation, and the galaxy trembled. Even with Angron's transformation, the Shadow Crusade did not annihilate Guilliman. The Ultramarines fought on with unbreakable discipline. Every defeat slowed, every retreat hardened their resolve. The 500 worlds shrank, scarred and mutilated, but they endured. Guilliman understood what Horus had unleashed. It was not simply rebellion, it was the destruction of trust itself. Ultramar had been built as an ideal of civilization, and the Shadow Crusade was the deliberate, systematic erasure of that idea. If it could fall, so could everything the Imperium stood for. By the time the Shadow Crusade burned itself out, Ultramar was scarred beyond recognition. Dozens of worlds lay in ruin, their populations massacred. Armatura and Nicaea were gone. Calth smouldered in warped taint. Angron had been damned to demonhood, and Lorgar had proven the power of chaos on a galactic scale. Yet Ultramar did not die. Guilliman survived, his legion bloody but unbowed. From the crucible of destruction, he forged resolve. The Ultramarines, once exemplars of order, now became warriors tempered by tragedy, no longer naive to the depths of betrayal. The Shadow Crusade had not destroyed Guilliman, it had hardened him into one of the Imperium's most determined defenders, a primarch who understood that survival, not perfection, was now the measure of victory. The fires of Ultramar but one front in the Age of Darkness, but their echoes reached Terra itself. The galaxy now knew that no realm, however prosperous, was safe from the Warmaster's hand. The heresy was not a war of generals alone, it was a galactic civil war, fought in the skies, in the streets, and in the souls of mankind. While Guilliman's Ultramarines bled in Ultramar, Horus's web spread further. The Warmaster knew that to bring the Imperium low, he could not rely on blades and fleets. He had to break the strongest of his brothers in spirit, corrupt them as he had been corrupted, and in doing so turn the Emperor's greatest champions into his most bitter foes. For the noble Sanguinius and his Blood Angels, that trial was set upon a false beacon of distress in the Cygnus cluster. The summons came in the language of desperation. Reports of Xenos infestations, of demonic manifestations, and of entire systems falling into nightmare filled with astropathic channels. The Emperor, still locked upon his golden throne and unable to intervene directly, trusted his angelic son to answer. With wings spread and heart steady, Sanguinius obeyed. He summoned his legion, thousands of Blood Angels assembling in glorious armadas, and together they set their course for Cygnus Prime. The trap had been set by Kabanda, a mighty demon of Khorne, and orchestrated by the Warmaster's agents. Horus had promised the Blood Angels to his new masters in the warp, and the law was irresistible, an entire system corrupted, crying out for deliverance. What better bait for Sanguinius, the most compassionate of the Emperor's sons, than souls in peril? The journey itself was a trial. The warp twisted around the fleet, bending reality into screaming shapes. Ships went silent without warning, their crews lost to madness. Vox choruses echoed with voices that did not belong to men. Even before they arrived, the Blood Angels knew something foul awaited them. Yet their Primarch did not falter. With serene certainty, he told his sons they would overcome. He promised them that the Emperor's light would guide them, even through the darkest storms. They believed him, because they always had. When the Armada translated into real space above Cygnus Prime, horror greeted them. The world was a jewel of spires and shining seas once, but now its surface writhed with corruption. Towers bent like broken bones, rivers ran red with blood, the very air shimmered with unreality, as though the planet itself was gasping under some cosmic sickness. Across the system, derelict fleets hung like carrion, their hulls infested with demonic growths, their crews long since devoured. The trap was sprung. No sooner had the Blood Angels made orbit than the demons came. The sky tore open with claws of crimson light, and from it poured legions of warp spawn. They swarmed across the planet into the void, their grotesque forms parodies of warriors and beasts, their weapons nothing but extensions of rage. At their head thundered Kabanda, colossal and terrible, his axe as wide as a tank, his wings blotting out the sun. He roared a challenge not to the Legion, but to Sanguinius himself. The Blood Angels descended to the surface, and war unlike any they had fought engulfed them. Bolters spat, chain swords howled, but for every demon slain, another clawed its way from the ether. The ground itself rebelled. Roads became rivers of gore. Buildings grew mouths that screamed and collapsed upon squads. Shadows became chains to drag men into the abyss. The Blood Angels fought on, red armoured phalanxes holding firm even as reality itself turned against them. At the heart of the slaughter, Sanguinius stood as a beacon. His wings, white as starlight, shone amid the smoke and blood. He cut demons apart with the blade of the Emperor himself. Each stroke an act of defiance against the warp's intrusion. His very presence lifted his sons, reminding them of their nobility even as the foe sought to drown them in madness. But this was no ordinary war. It was a trial of corruption. The Blood Angels bore within them a flaw, an imperfection buried in their gene seed, a whisper of rage and bloodlust that could one day consume them. Horus and his demonic allies sought to rip that flaw open, to force the Legion to surrender to it and fall into the service of the Blood God. The battlefield itself was designed to be a crucible, every death, every drop of blood feeding the warp's hunger. For days the Blood Angels fought, their losses mounting, their resolve tested. Commander pressed his attack again and again, seeking to break Sanguinius in combat, for he knew that if the Angel fell, so too would his Legion. Twice they clashed upon the blasted plains of Cygnus. In their first battle, Commander's fury was unmatched. The demon struck Sanguinius down, breaking his legs and hurling him aside like a broken doll. The Angel's sons cried out in anguish, their discipline fraying as their father lay wounded. For a moment, it seemed like the trap had succeeded. The flaw within them surged forth, the red thirst overtaking countless warriors. They tore into the demons with savagery that mirrored Khorne's own, their nobility drowned beneath the taste of blood. But Sanguinius rose again. Even broken, even bleeding he stood. His voice carried across the battlefield, steady and commanding, reminding his sons of who they were, not butchers, not slaves to rage, but the Emperor's angels. Slowly, painfully, he pulled them back from the brink. The red thirst remained, but it was chained once more, leashed by the loyalty of sheer force of their primarch's will. The second battle with Commander was different. Sanguinius met the demon not as a victim, but as avenger. Though his body ached with every motion, his spirit blazed brighter than ever. Their duel shook the world itself. Demon and primarch trading blows that cracked the sky. At last, with the Emperor's blade, Sanguinius struck Commander down. The demon form exploded into a form of ash and fire, banished back into the Immaterium. Though victorious, the cost was staggering. Tens of thousands of Blood Angels lay dead, their gene seed torn from them by demonic claws or corrupted beyond recovery. The survivors bore the mark of what they had endured. The red thirst gnawed deeper than ever, its presence undeniable. The flaw could no longer be hidden. It was part of them now, as much as their wings and their blood. When the Blood Angels finally withdrew from Cygnus, it was not in triumph but in grim survival. They had endured the trap, resisted the corruption, and slain the demon that sought to enslave them. But they carried their burden openly now. The Angel and his sons were scarred, their nobility shadowed by the thirst that haunted them. Yet in this too was their strength. Sanguinius had proven that even faced with damnation, he and his legion could resist. Horus had sought to break them, but instead he had tempered them. The Blood Angels emerged from Cygnus Prime not as the same warriors who had entered, but as soldiers hardened by revelation. They knew their flaw, and knew it could destroy them. But they also knew so long as they followed their angel, they would endure. Cygnus Prime was left a ruin, a world defied forever by demonic presence. But the Blood Angels lived, and though they bore the thirst within them, their wings had not been torn. They would fly still, and their greatest trial was yet to come, on the walls of Terra itself. As the legions bled across the stars, another war ignited in the very heart of the Imperium. On Mars, cradle of mankind's machines, forge of every weapon that armed the Great Crusade, for centuries Terra and Mars had existed in fragile harmony, bound by the Treaty of Olympus Mons, a pact that united the Emperor and the Mechanicum. In exchange for recognition of their ancient rights and dominion over technology, the Red planet's forges beat ceaselessly to arm the Great Crusade. Titans, void ships, and the gene forges of the Astartes all flowed from the Martian forges. Mars was the Imperium's beating heart of industry, but when Horus raised his banner in rebellion, the heart tore itself in two. The Mechanicum had always been divided. Beneath the surface unity of the cult Mechanicus seethed rivalries and dogmas. Some worshipped the Omnissiah as the Emperor Incarnate, the union of flesh and machine promised since the Dark Age of technology. Others whispered that the Emperor was a pretender, a usurper who denied them access to forbidden law and curbed their quest for knowledge. When word of Horus's rebellion reached Mars, those divisions boiled over. At the centre of it all was Fabricator General Kelbar Hal, master of the Mechanicum. He had chafed for years under the Emperor's restraints, resenting every edict that forbade innovation and prescribed certain sciences as heresy. When Horus sent envoys promising liberation, unrestricted knowledge, and communion with powers greater than the Emperor, Kelbar Hal listened. His loyalty was not to Terra, but to the pursuit of knowledge unbound by morality, and so he swore fealty to the Warmaster. But not all on Mars agreed. Loyalist forges refused his decrees. Magi who still revered the Emperor as the true Omnissiah raised their own banners, calling upon Titan legions and Skitarii cohorts to defend their allegiance. What had once been the Great Forge World became a battlefield, its manufactura turned into fortresses, its data shrines into command centres, its plasma reactors into weapons of annihilation. The war that followed was unlike any other. This was not legion against legion, nor mortal armies against Xenos. It was machine against machine, Titan against Titan, Skitarii against Skitarii. Across the red deserts of Mars, god engines clashed. Warlord Titans levelled cities in single volleys, their plasma annihilators reducing kilometres of hab blocks to vitrified glass. Reaver Titans stalked between the ruins, unleashing barrages that split mountains. Warhounds darted through the smog like hunting hounds, their turbo lasers slicing apart loyalist and traitor alike. Each battle was apocalyptic, fought not for conquest but for the soul of the Mechanicum itself. Above the sands, the void burned. Orbital defence platforms switched allegiances, unleashing salvos against fleets from Terra, then falling silent as counter-sabotage crippled their systems. Whole manufactura fleets, armadas of vessels built to carry raw materials and refined goods, were repurposed into weapons of war. Battle barges meant to resupply the legions instead rained fire upon Terra's allies. The bloodshed was matched by horrors unseen. Kael Borhal opened the gates of forbidden knowledge. His allies, the so-called Dark Mechanicum, experimented without restraint. They bound demons into engines, fusing warp entities with machine shells. They forged automata powered by the screaming souls of the dead. Where loyalist Skitarii marched in disciplined ranks, their traitor counterparts bristled with unholy augmentations. Servo limbs fashioned from bone, optics that glowed with warp fire, weapons crafted into flesh. The Red Planet became a cauldron of innovation and heresy, its surface scarred with technologies too vile for sane minds. The Loyalists fought with equal fervour. They invoked the Emperor's name as the true Omnissiah, their sermons encoded in bursts of machine code, their hymns transmitted as binary litanies across data networks. In their eyes, every Titan that stood with them was not merely a machine but a cathedral of steel, a shrine of loyalty. They fought to preserve the sanctity of the pact with Terra, knowing that if Mars fell entirely to Horus, the Imperium's supply lines would collapse. But the tide turned against them. Kael Borhal's command of the Martian forges gave him endless resources. For every Titan fielded by the Loyalists, the traitors birthed too. For every Skitarii cohort shattered, another rose from the gene vats, clad in profane enhancements. His pact with Horus was not merely political, it was spiritual. The dark gods lent their power to his creations, and Mars, once the red jewel of the Mechanicum, darkened into a forge of nightmares. Terra could not save Mars. The Emperor was bound to his golden throne, wrestling with the Webway catastrophe. Rogal Dorn fortified the palace, preparing for the siege he knew must come. No fleet could be spared, no legion redeployed. While Horus pressed his advantage elsewhere, Mars was left to burn, its war a private apocalypse between brothers of the machine. The cost was incalculable. Loyalist Titan legions, such as the Legio Tempestus, fought to the last engine, their banners burning as their god machines toppled. Data vaults containing knowledge from the dark age of technology were annihilated to prevent their capture. Entire forged cities sank beneath oceans of molten metal. Their reactors detonated rather than let them fall into traitor hands. Loyalist Magi, their bodies half machine, chose self-destruction, overloading their own reactors to take traitor cohorts with them in fire. By the end, Mars lay in ruin. Its surface was a patchwork of blasted deserts, its once proud spires shattered, its forges corrupted. The Loyalists who survived were few, and many fled into exile, retreating aboard void ship to continue their work far from their birthplace. Those who remained were hunted, their names erased, their forges subsumed into the Dark Mechanicum. Kael Borhal stood triumphant. Mars was his, though it was no longer the Mars of old. It was a twisted echo, a forge world remade in the image of corruption. From its depths poured demon engines, corrupted titans, and weapons that defied all natural law. The Dark Mechanicum would become the beating heart of the Warmaster's war effort, supplying his legions with horrors that Terra could barely comprehend, let alone match. Yet even in defeat, the lawless Mechanicum endured. Magi who had escaped carried their knowledge to Terra, where they reforged their vows to the Emperor. In the shadow of the Imperial Palace, loyalist forges beat still, diminished but unbroken, crafting the weapons that would one day resist Horus upon the walls of the throne world. The schism of Mars was not a battle with banners and victory parades. It was a sundering, a rift that would never heal. Where once mankind's faith in the machine had united Terra and Mars, now it was split forever, half bound to the Emperor, half to Horus and the gods of the warp. The Red Planet became both cradle and grave, its forges hammering the nails of the Imperium's coffin even as the scattered loyalists laboured to resist. When history remembers the Horus Heresy, it recalls Isstvan, Calth, and Terra. But in truth, the heresy could not have endured without Mars. The betrayal of the Mechanicum gave Horus the machines of war he needed to challenge the Emperor. The Red Sands, once sacred, were forever stained with the oil and blood of brother against brother. The galaxy had burned, from Isstvan's plains to Calth's poison caverns, from the shadow of Prospero to the ashes of Ultramar. The heresy had carved its way across the stars, but every battle, every betrayal, every ruined world had always pointed towards one inevitable destination: Terra. The throne world, cradle of humanity, seat of the Emperor's power. To strike Terra was to strike the heart, to either end the rebellion or crown Horus as a master of mankind. And so began the greatest trial of the Imperium, the Solar War. For years, the Imperium had struggled to slow the Warmaster's advance. Guilliman was cut off by the Ruinstorm, Vulcan was captive, Corax was shattered, and so much of the Legion's strength lay buried at Isstvan. The Emperor himself no longer strode among his sons. Chained to the Golden Throne, his will bent upon holding the webway closed against the endless flood of demons. All that remained to bar Horus's path was rogue Dawn, Praetorian of Terra, who had turned the throne world and its system into a fortress the likes of which the galaxy had never seen. Dawn's genius was not in glory but in endurance. Where others built empires, he built walls. The Sol system was no longer a realm of planets, it was a bastion. Saturn bristled with defence platforms and minefields dense enough to shred fleets. Jupiter's moons became arsenals and shipyards, repurposed into fortress stations. Mars, once Imperium's ally, had fallen into the grip of the Dark Mechanicum, but its forges still burned, feeding Horus's war machine. Every world, every moon, every void station was either a shield or a blade. The Solar War would be fought not only above Terra, but across every inch of the system. When Horus came, he came with everything. The Warmaster's armadas were vast beyond measure, Legion fleets swollen with renegade vessels, demon-bound warships of the Dark Mechanicum, and engines of destruction not seen since the Dark Age of technology. Titans slumbered in the holds of void ships, waiting to be unleashed on the throne world. The traitor legions had bled the galaxy dry, and now they gathered for the final assault. The heavens darkened as his forces entered the system, and for the first time in history, Sol itself trembled. The first clashes came at the edges, where loyalist picket fleets met the vanguard of Horus's armada. The void burned with duels between warships the size of continents. Escorts darted between titanic battleships like gnats around leviathans. Torpedo salvos streaked across the void. The defenders fought with desperation, for they knew every hour bought was another hour for Dawn to complete his bastions, and for Terra to prepare. Entire flotillas were sacrificed to delay the traitors' passage through the Orc Cloud and the scattered stations of the Outer Rim. Then came the war for the gas giants. At Saturn and Jupiter, battles raged that dwarfed anything the Imperium had ever seen. Defence rings poured fire into traitor fleets, shattering hulls and vaporising thousands, but Horus's numbers could not be stopped. Traitor titans were unleashed on the moons, scouring them of life, while demonic engines poured through rent reality to tear apart void stations. Saturn's great orbital platforms fought to the last, detonating their reactors in martyrdom rather than allow capture. The system bled, one world at a time. Even as the traitors advanced, Dawn struck back with cold precision. He hurled counterfleets into the gaps, orchestrating retreats that turned into ambushes, sacrificing squadrons to lure traitor battleships into minefields. Every move was designed not to win, but to slow. The Solar War was a war of attrition, and Dawn meant to grind the Warmaster's vast armada against the walls of Sol until only wreckage remained. Yet even Dawn's brilliance could not halt that tide forever. The traitor fleets pressed onward, and the war reached Mars. Once loyal, the red planet now pulsed with the corruption of the Dark Mechanicum. From its forges came war machines bound with demonic essence, warships clad in obsidian armour, engines howling with the voices of the damned. Loyalist attempts to retake Mars had long since failed. Now it stood as a fortress of Horus within the very heart of the system. Battles erupted in orbit above its crimson desert as loyalist flotillas tried to bypass the guns of the traitor-forged cities. Some succeeded, some were obliterated in storms of warp-forged fire. The schism of Mars bore its final fruit. The enemy had a foothold in Sol itself. Through it all, Terra waited. On the throne world, billions toiled to prepare for the storm. The Imperial Palace had become the greatest fortress ever built, its walls stretching for hundreds of kilometres, its bastions armed with weapons that could shatter titans. Civilian populations were conscripted into militias, their lives measured only in minutes should the walls be breached. The ecclesiarchy preached faith in the Emperor, even as the imperial truth forbade it, for in those desperate days only belief could steady trembling hands. Sanguinius had returned to Terra, his blood angel scarred by the nightmare of Cygnus but unbroken. Dawn welcomed him as brother and comrade, knowing the angel's presence would be needed to hold both the line and the hearts of the defenders. The white scars under Jagatai Khan slipped into the system as well, their hit-and-run fleets harassing Horus's vanguard with lightning raids, sowing disruption where they could. But others were absent. Guilliman was still trapped beyond the Runestorm. The Lion waged his secret wars in the galactic east. Vulcan remained lost. Terra would be defended, but not by the full measure of its champions. For months the Solar War raged. Every world became a battlefield, every station a citadel, every asteroid a potential ambush. The void was littered with the husks of warships, their corpses forming fields of wreckage that served as both obstacle and grave. Millions died each day, nameless soldiers whose sacrifice brought a little more time for the palace. Yet for all their valour, the defenders could not hold the system forever. Piece by piece, the Warmaster's fleet closed in, until at last only Terra remained. It was then that the scale of what was coming settled upon the soul of everyone in the Imperium. This was no longer a war of distant stars, no longer a rebellion fought on the edge of perception. The traitors were at the Emperor's door, their guns pointed at the cradle of humanity. Every loss across the galaxy, every betrayal, every sacrifice, had led here. The Solar War had been fought to delay the inevitable, and now the inevitable had arrived. The void above Terra burned, the outer defences shattered, and Horus's banners advanced towards the throne world. The Warmaster's path to the Golden Throne lay open, carved in blood and fire. The defenders stood ready, their walls unbroken, their spirits stilled. The Solar War had ended. The Siege of Terra was about to begin. Horus had broken through the outer system, leaving behind wreckage and martyrdom in his wake. His fleets, swollen with traitor legions, demon-haunted vessels, and corrupted engines of the Dark Mechanicum, now gathered above the throne world itself. Terra, the cradle of mankind, the heart of the Imperium, faced its darkest hour. The Imperial Palace, already vast beyond comprehension, had been remade by Rogal Dawn into the greatest fortress ever constructed by human hands. Its walls stretched for hundreds of kilometres, its bastions towered higher than mountains, and its guns could tear apart titans. The Himalaysian mountains were carved into trenches and redoubts. The outer walls bristled with artillery, the inner walls with layer upon layer of kill zones and choke points. Every gate was a citadel, every courtyard a killing ground, every street a place where millions might die in minutes. Dawn had transformed the Emperor's home into the bastion that could stand against the galaxy itself. The defenders were countless. The Imperial Fists, Dawn's own legion, manned the walls with unshakable discipline. The Blood Angels, led by Sanguinius, stood beside them, scarred by their ordeal at Cygnus, but radiant in their resolve. The White Scars, Jagatai Khan's swift warriors, were scattered across the approaches, harassing traitor encampments, striking like lightning before vanishing. Alongside them stood the Emperor's most faithful, the Legio Custodes, his golden guardians, unmatched in their skill, and the Sisters of Silence, null maidens whose presence made the demons recoil in pain. Behind them, billions of mortal soldiers. Imperial army regiments, hive militias, and conscripted civilians, waited with lasguns and faith, knowing their lives would be measured in hours when the walls were breached. Above the planet, the void boiled with fire. Orbital defences hurled salvos into the oncoming armada, shattering some, slowing others, but the traitors were too many. Horus hurled his legions forward, and the heavens turned red with bombardment. For days the skies screamed as shells the size of hadblocks fell upon Terra. Hive cities trembled, oceans boiled, and the Himalaysian walls shook under constant fire, but Dawn's fortifications held. The walls stood, and the defenders endured. Then the ground war began. The first assaults fell upon the outer walls. Traitor titans strode from their landing ships, colossal silhouettes wreathed in smoke. The Legio Mortis, corrupted engines bristling with demonic fury, advanced against the loyalist god engines of Legio Ignatium and Legio Solaria. The battles of the titans were apocalyptic, their weapons carving craters kilometres wide, their steps crushing thousands of men beneath them. Warhounds duelled through shattered streets, reavers battled in ruins, and warlords clashed like mountains tearing themselves apart. Each victory was Pyrrhic, each loss another hole in the line. The traitor legions followed in their shadow. The sons of Horus advanced with grim purpose, their former brothers' tactics now turned against the Emperor. The Death Guard brought pestilence, their shells filled with toxins that lingered in the trenches, rotting defenders alive. The Emperor's children, drunk on sensation, hurled themselves at the walls with blasphemous songs, turning slaughter into symphony. The World Eaters came in howling waves, Angron himself among them, now a demon prince, his form towering above the battlefield, every blow of his axe carving swaths through the defenders by the hundred. The defenders met them with unflinching courage. The Imperial Fist stood like the walls themselves, firing until their barrels glowed, then meeting the foe with chainswords and fists. The Blood Angels hurled themselves from the walls in counterattacks, wings of white and crimson cutting through the tide. Custodians fought wherever the line faltered, each golden warrior carving a path through dozens of traitors before finally succumbing to the weight of numbers. The Sisters of Silence move like shadows, their presence snuffing out sorcery, their blades finding the hearts of demon and psyker alike. And always above Sanguinius' sword, his wings were a banner of hope, his voice carrying across Vox and battlefield alike. Where he fought, men rallied, even as the skies rained fire. Where he struck, demons faltered. He was the light upon the wall, even as the darkness closed in. The traitors pressed endlessly, their numbers without limit. For every wave broken on the walls, another rose from the smoke. The ground before the palace became a graveyard, a plain of corpses, twisted metal, and shattered engines. The earth itself drank so much blood that it turned to black mud. The air grew thick with the stench of rot, the screams of the dying, the howls of demons, and the endless thunder of artillery. Yet still the walls held. Days turned into weeks, and the siege dragged on. Horus had hoped for a swift strike, for terror to overwhelm resistance. Instead, Dawn's bastions became ambles upon which the traitor legions broke themselves again and again. The defenders gave no ground, even as casualties mounted beyond measure. But even the strongest walls can be broken. Slowly, cracks began to appear. The traitors infiltrated supply tunnels, collapsing bastions from within. Sorcerers of the Wordbearers summoned warp rifts that vomited demons directly into trenches. Night Lords sowed terror behind the lines, assassinating officers and spreading panic. The Alpha Legion whispered false orders into loyalist Vox channels, turning defences into chaos. With each passing day, the noose tightened. For all their courage, the defenders knew the truth. Terror could not endure forever. The walls would fall. It was only a question of when, and how much time could be bought before the inevitable breach. That time, that blood, was the currency of the siege. Dawn meant to spend it all to keep the Emperor upon his throne long enough for a final reckoning. The Siege of Terra was not a single battle. It was an age of nightmare, a storm without end. The Emperor's walls stood defiant, but the Warmaster's hordes were endless, and each sunrise brought new horrors. Titans dueling across plains, demons howling in the ruins, primarch against primarch in duels that cracked the earth. This was the crucible where the fate of mankind would be decided. The walls of terror had endured the unendurable. For weeks and months the traitor legions had hurled themselves against the palace, and though the bastions shook, they had not fallen. Yet Rogel Dawn knew it was only a matter of time. Every day the dead piled higher, every hour saw another breach sealed with blood alone. And then the moment came when the siege reached its climax, not upon the battlements, but in the heavens above. Horus, the Warmaster, the Emperor's most beloved son and now his greatest foe, had grown impatient. The siege dragged on, and the longer it did, the greater the chance that relief might come. Guilliman, the Lion, or even the shattered remnants of loyalist legions might yet arrive to trap him. Horus would not risk it, so he made a choice. He lowered the shields of his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, daring the Emperor to come to him. It was a challenge, a taunt, and a trap. The Emperor accepted. Leaving Dawn to command the defence, the Master of Mankind gathered his chosen. Sanguinius, Angel of the Ninth Legions whose wings carried hope across the walls. Rogel Dawn, unbending Praetorian, though the Emperor ordered him to remain behind to lead the defence below. And Malcador the Sigillite, loyal to the last, who took his place upon the Golden Throne, his mortal body sacrificed to keep the webway breach sealed. The Emperor ascended with his custodians and his sons into the orbiting nightmare of the Vengeful Spirit, and the final battle began. The ship itself was no longer mere iron and steel. The warp had bled into its corridors, twisting them into a labyrinth of madness. Bulkheads wept blood, hallways stretched into impossible infinity, demons prowled its deck, summoned by the corruption of the Warmaster's pact. The Emperor's companions fought through it all, custodians cutting down horrors that should never have existed, blood angels and fists carving a path through demonic hordes and traitor elites. Each chamber was a battlefield, each stairwell a grave. Sanguinius went ahead, drawn by destiny. Alone, the angel entered the chamber where Horus awaited him. What passed there can only be glimpsed in fragments carried by legend. The two brothers spoke, perhaps even pleaded. Horus, magnificent and terrible, offered his brother a place at his side. Sanguinius, noble and unbroken, refused. They fought, and though Sanguinius' courage was without equal, he could not match the Warmaster, swollen with favour of all four Chaos Gods. The duel ended with Sanguinius' death. His blood stained the deck of the Vengeful Spirit, his broken body a martyrdom that would echo through all the ages of mankind. Then the Emperor entered. What followed was no duel of equals, but the climax of all creation struggle. Father against son, God against chosen, light against darkness. Horus, armed with the gifts of chaos, wielded power to unmake reality itself. The Emperor, though weakened by years of sacrifice and the burden of the Golden Throne, answered with the limitless fury of his will. Their blows shook the ship, tore rents in the warp, and reverberated across Terra itself. For a time, neither yielded. Yet the Emperor still loved his son. Time and again he sought not to destroy Horus, but to reach him, to pierce the veil of corruption and bring him back. Horus mocked him, striking harder, each blow tearing away the hope of redemption. Finally, as the Emperor hesitated, Horus seized his chance. With one strike, empowered by the Dark Gods, he wounded the Master of Mankind grievously, casting him to the ground. For a moment, it seemed the Emperor would be undone, and chaos would reign. It was then, in that final instant, that Horus revealed the fullness of his damnation. A lone warrior of the Imperial army, insignificant in the scale of gods and primarchs, stumbled into the chamber. Horus turned upon him, and with casual cruelty obliterated him where he stood, shattering the man's body with contempt. The Emperor saw in that moment the truth. His son was lost. There was no redemption, no spark of loyalty left, only arrogance, only hatred, only the will of the ruinous powers. And so the Emperor struck without restraint. He unleashed the totality of his psychic might, the power of a god born in human form. His attack tore through Horus's defences, ripping apart the gifts of the Chaos Gods, annihilating body and soul. The Warmaster screamed as his form was burned from existence, his essence obliterated in an instant. Horus Lupercal, one of the most beloved of the Emperor's sons, was no more. The Chaos Gods themselves recoiled, their champion destroyed by the hand of his father. But victory came with sacrifice. The Emperor's body was broken beyond repair. In destroying Horus, he had expended all that remained of his strength. Dawn found him upon the Vengeful Spirit, his form shattered, his lifeblood spilling away. Around him lay the ashes of victory and the ruin of sacrifice. Sanguinius was dead, Horus annihilated, and the Emperor himself dying. There was no time for grief. The defenders still fought on Terra, unaware their fate had been decided above. Dawn and the surviving custodians bore the Emperor back to the Golden Throne. There he was interred, his ruined body sustained by arcane machinery, his mind imprisoned within a prison of psychic fire. The throne that had once been his tool became his tomb. The war was over, Horus was slain. The traitor legions, now leaderless, fell into disarray, retreating back into the warp. Terra was scarred, with half of the palace in ruins and billions dead, but it stood. The Imperium endured, yet the price of this was the Emperor himself. No longer would he walk among his people, no longer would his voice be heard by his sons. He had given everything to preserve mankind, and in doing so had consigned himself to eternal imprisonment upon the throne. The Siege of Terra had ended in both victory and tragedy. Humanity was saved, but the dream of the Great Crusade was gone. The Emperor's Imperium would survive, but it would be a shadow of what he had intended, a realm built upon sacrifice and silence. The angel lay slain, the Warmaster obliterated, and the father entombed upon his throne. Across Terra, the scale of devastation was almost beyond comprehension. The Himalaysian mountains had been torn open, their peaks levelled to feed the fires of war. The Imperial Palace, once a monument of mankind's unity, was a scarred husk with half its halls collapsed and its outer walls blackened by firestorms. Corpses lay in mountains where trenches had run, uncountable dead whose names would never be recorded. The skies themselves were clouded with smoke, the oceans poisoned by the wreckage of war, and the air carried the bitter tang of ash. The survivors staggered amid the ruins. Soldiers of the Imperial army who had held the line to the last, their eyes hollow with exhaustion, now marched in silence. Civilians who had taken up arms to defend their homes now wept in the shadows of shattered hives. Even the Astartes, those who had endured every trial of the heresy, were broken. Legions that had once numbered in the hundreds of thousands were reduced to fragments. The Blood Angels, though they had stood with their angelic primarch until the end, mourned Sanguinius with a grief that could never be healed. The Imperial Fists, having defended every wall and gate, carried the weight of brothers lost in countless counterattacks. The White Scars, elusive and swift, had survived, but their numbers were thinned by battles that had no room for withdrawal. And above them all, in the heart of the palace, the Emperor remained. His body, shattered by his final duel with Horus, could not be healed. His mortal shell was ruined, his once mighty form reduced to a husk of flesh sustained only by the life-preserving machinery of the Golden Throne. He spoke no words, gave no commands. His will, vast and immeasurable, still radiated through the warp, shielding humanity from horrors beyond and guiding his people with a light they could feel but never hear again. But to his sons and to his people, he was silent. The Emperor was victorious, and yet he was lost. For Rogel Dawn, the pain was the rawest. He had carried his father's ruined form from the Vengeful Spirit, only to watch him returned upon the throne. The Praetorian of Terra had defended every wall, every gate, every bastion, but at the last he had not been able to save the one thing that mattered most. He cast himself into grief and duty alike, swearing that the Imperium would endure, whatever the cost. Malcador the Sigillite, who had taken the Emperor's place upon the throne to hold the webway breach shut, was gone, burned out in an instant by the immensity of the task. His body was dust, his name consigned to legend. Yet his sacrifice had held, and Terra endured because of it. The traitors fled. With Horus dead, the unity of the Warmaster's cause crumbled. The sons of Horus gathered what remained of their legion and vanished into the warp, their names soon cursed and reviled. The Emperor's children, shattered and debased, wandered into the Eye of Terror, enslaved by their pursuit of sensation. The Death Guard limped into the storm, their bodies bloated with pestilence, their primarch lost to corruption. The World Eaters fled as rabid packs, their primarch consumed by his own demonhood. One by one, the traitor legions scattered into exile, dragging with them the memory of treachery and the poison of chaos. The heresy had failed to destroy the Imperium outright, but its scars would never fade. For the Loyalists, the years that followed were no less cruel. The legions were broke apart, their vast armies divided into smaller chapters to prevent such a rebellion from ever rising again. Guilliman, freed at last from the Ruin Storm, returned to Terra and took command, not as Warmaster but as an architect of survival. From the ruins of the Great Crusade he built the Codex Astartes, a new doctrine that would shape the legions into smaller, more disciplined chapters, their independence a safeguard against the treachery of another Horus. To some it was wisdom, to others an insult to the legacy of the legions who had bled for Terra. But there was no choice, the Imperium would endure only through order. The galaxy itself was a ruin. Warp storms still howled, tearing apart the fragile lines of communication that had once bound mankind together. Billions of worlds, isolated and terrified, no longer knew whether Terra had survived. Many broke away, declaring their independence, only to be crushed by new crusades of reconquest. The Xenos, long beaten down by the Great Crusade, now rose again, sensing weakness. Orc Wars, Eldar raiders, and tyrants of forgotten empires seized the opportunity to reclaim what they had lost. The Imperium that emerged from the heresy was not the bright unity of the Great Crusade. It was a fortress, suspicious and unyielding, forever at war. The people of the Imperium, once taught the imperial truth and that there were no gods, only mankind and reason, turned instead to faith. The Emperor, silent upon his throne, became a god in their eyes, not the god he had denied, but the god they needed. Priests rose in his name, declaring him the saviour of humanity, the only true deity. His sacrifice at Terra was spoken of as divine, his light across the warp seen as proof of godhood. In the ashes of betrayal, the imperial cult was born, and with it the foundations of the ecclesiarchy. The Emperor, once a man striving to free mankind from superstition, was enthroned as the God Emperor of mankind. The heresy had ended, but its echoes would never fade. For the traitors, it was damnation eternal. For the Loyalists, it was the death of innocence. The Great Crusade had sought to build an imperium of reason, unity and progress. What emerged was an empire of war, faith and sacrifice. The dream was gone, replaced by survival. The Imperium was reborn not in triumph, but in mourning. 10,000 years have passed, and still the Emperor sits immobile upon his throne, his will radiating through the immaterium, his people worshipping him as their god. The legions are long gone, their successors carrying their legacy in fragments. The traitors linger in the Eye of Terror, their vengeance eternal, their hatred undying. The galaxy is still aflame, and the price of heresy is paid every day in blood. The dawn of the Imperium was no sunrise. It was the light of pyres across Terra, the glow of fires upon ruined walls, the dim illumination of a dying age. Yet in that faint light mankind endured. And so long as the Emperor sits upon the throne, silent and eternal, the Imperium will fight on, no matter the cost. You have heard the saga of the Horus Heresy, the fall of Brotherhood, the Siege of Terra, and the Emperor's last sacrifice. From that age of darkness came the Imperium we know, scarred, unyielding, eternal. But the price of survival was paid in blood, and the echoes of betrayal still haunt the stars. If you would walk further into the archives of mankind's past, strike the seal of subscription, and let your name be recorded among the faithful. This is Dominissimo Voxlor, signing off from the abyss of history. Until the next transmission, remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war.